The winter wind came crawling down from the high New Mexico ridges like a wild, starving creature moaning against the cracked walls of Clara Hayes's cabin. Snowflakes drifted across the darkened sky in slow, lazy spirals, but the cold behind them carried a biting edge sharp enough to cut bone. It was the kind of cold that stole a person's breath when they stepped outside, the kind that made an old cabin tremble on its foundation and turned the world into a barren stretch of white silence. Inside that small home on the frontier, the same one Clara had once filled with laughter, music, and the steady strength of her late husband, there stood a wooden table empty as a dried-out creek bed in high summer that Clara sat before it, her hands wrapped around herself, her shawl doing little to stop the trembling in her shoulders. A lantern swung lightly from a nail overhead, the flame flickering like it too was fighting to stay alive. Shadows moved across the walls, long and thin, reaching across the room as though trying to fill the emptiness. But nothing could hide the truth. Her pantry shelves were bare. The sacks she once filled with beans, flour, cornmeal, all gone. A year ago, she and her husband Ethan had shared a hearty Christmas dinner at that very table, passing dishes back and forth while teasing each other about who burned the biscuits or whose stew tasted too smoky. Back then, she thought there would always be another holiday, another winter, another season together. But fate, as the frontier had a cruel way of proving, rarely bowed to anyone's plans. Ethan had died in spring thrown from his horse on a steep ridge while hunting for game. She'd buried him under a juniper tree, marking the grave the way he would have wanted, simple, respectful, facing the rising sun. Since then, Clara had learned to survive on her own. She had learned how to split wood, how to mend fences, how to ride to the settlement for supplies, how to walk back with a rifle slung over her shoulder and her heart threaded with quiet determination. She wasn't helpless, and she wasn't weak, but grief had a way of wearing down the strongest settler like wind-carving stone. The loneliness crept into her bones more than the cold ever had. Now, on Christmas Eve, she sat staring at that empty table set with a single plate she'd placed out of habit rather than expectation. "Lord," she whispered, her breath fogging in the chilled air, "I just need a little strength to get through this night." Her voice sounded too loud in the silence. No horse whinnied outside, no footsteps walked across her porch, no pot simmered on her stove. Just the groan of the cabin walls and the crackle of her dying fire. She rose, pulling her wool skirt closer, and stepped outside to gather the last bit of wood she had left. But when she reached the woodpile, she found it buried under a thick crust of ice. She tried scraping it, but the bark remained sealed tight. Her fingers numbed instantly, pain shooting up her arms. Her breath shook. "Can't even get a fire going proper," she muttered, her tone wavering between defeated and furious. The snow swallowed her words. She cupped her arms around herself and returned inside, rubbing her hands to restore feeling. Her lantern's light reflected off the frosted window, making it impossible to see beyond the darkness outside. Clara relit the fire with the few small sticks left in the bin, pushing them close together to coax flame. But it was weak, barely enough to warm the space around it. She took a chair and placed it near the hearth. Sitting and drawing her blanket over her knees, the emptiness pressed in harder than ever. She thought of Christmas traditions she once adored, singing carols in the settlement with neighbors, exchanging small gifts, cooking for Ethan, hanging a dried cedar wreath on the door. She'd lost all of it now. Even the cedar wreath had crumbled away in the autumn winds. Memories were all she had left, and they weighed heavy tonight. The lantern dimmed, casting long shadows across the empty table where a feast should have been. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away stubbornly, refusing to let sorrow swallow her whole. "This is just one night," she told herself. "Just one night alone." But she didn't believe it. Hours passed slowly. She was just beginning to doze off, drifting between sleep and the sharp bite of cold, when she heard something, a soft, muffled sound from outside. Her eyes shot open. She straightened in her chair, heart pounding. Another sound. A faint crunch of snow. Then, a thud. Not loud, but clear enough to pierce the silence. Clara inhaled sharply. Folks didn't travel this far out after dark, not in a storm, not on Christmas Eve. Wolves sometimes roamed the edge of her land. She reached for her rifle, leaning by the door, cradling it close. She stood still, listening. The wind? A shifting tree? No. Soft footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Her grip tightened on the rifle. She moved quietly toward the door, each step careful on the wooden floor. When she reached it, she pressed her ear against the cold wood, listening hard. A tiny giggle echoed from outside, a child's giggle. Clara froze, confusion flooding through her. A child? Out here? At night? In the middle of a snowstorm? Her breath quickened. Slowly, with controlled caution, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. The lantern light spilled onto the porch, revealing 3 silhouettes framed against the falling snow: a tall man wrapped in a deerskin cloak, and 2 children huddled close on either side of him. The man's long dark hair glistened with frost, his posture strong but peaceful. The older child, a little girl with bright eyes, held a woven basket covered with a warm cloth. The younger boy clutched a clay pot with steam rising from its lid. The man bowed his head slightly. "You are alone tonight," he said, his voice deep and steady. "We bring food if you will accept it." Clara swallowed hard. "Taza?" she whispered. Her Apache neighbor. The one who lived across the dry creek bed. The one she had rarely spoken to, yet often seen working with quiet dignity. The one whose kindness, until now, she had never truly witnessed. The snow continued falling around them. The cold bit at her skin. But something warm rose inside her chest, a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in months. The little girl stepped forward, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "We didn't see your fire," she said softly. "Papa worried you might be hungry." Clara's throat tightened. Her eyes stung. She lowered the rifle slowly, ashamed she ever held it toward them. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "I have nothing to offer you." Taza met her gaze, calm and honest. "You offer your presence," he said. "It is enough." And just like that, on a night when Clara believed she would break under the weight of loneliness, something extraordinary happened. Someone knocked, someone cared. Someone came to share warmth, food, and perhaps, though she didn't yet know it, a new beginning she never imagined. The snow outside Clara Hayes' cabin had thickened through the night, laying a pristine white blanket over the sloping hills and brittle sagebrush. The world seemed muffled, a silent expanse punctuated only by the soft crunch of boots in the snow. Inside, the small cabin glowed from the weak lanterns she had lit. But the warmth did little to chase away the memory of the empty table, the gnawing hunger, and the years of loss that weighed on her chest. Just when she thought the night could not stretch any lonelier. Another sound came, a soft, irregular tap at the door. Clara's heart stopped, her breath caught. Who could be out in such a storm, trudging through drifts high as a small child? Her first instinct, honed by months of frontier solitude, was caution. She glanced at her rifle leaning against the wall. Her hand hovered above it. A giggle came next to bright, human sound so startling in the hushed night that it made her chest ache. It was impossible for it to be a wolf. Wolves didn't laugh. Wolves didn't carry warmth in their voices. Clara's knuckles whitened as she approached the door. Her mind raced through the possibilities: bandits, lost travelers, wolves in some disguise of human noise. But something in the tone of the laughter pulled at her, a fragile thread of hope she hadn't dared feel in months. Slowly, cautiously, she unlatched the door. Outside stood Taza, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a deerskin cloak dusted with snow, his dark hair glinting like coal against the white backdrop. Beside him, huddled close for warmth, were his 2 children, Lena, a bright-eyed girl of 10, clutching a woven basket, and Matu, a smaller boy of 6, holding a clay pot that sent faint wisps of steam curling into the cold night air. Clara froze. Her mind struggled to grasp the scene. Taza, her Apache neighbor, quiet, respectful, often distant, stood before her not as a shadow on the horizon, not as a figure of fear from stories and rumors, but as a man bearing gifts in the snow. The contrast between what she had been taught and what she now saw was stark. "You are alone tonight," Taza said in careful English, his voice steady, calm, yet softened by an unfamiliar warmth. "We bring food, if you wish." Clara's lips parted, and she wanted to ask why, wanted to challenge him, wanted to retreat into the safety of her cabin walls. But the scent hit her first, roasted venison, thick and savory, mingling with the rich sweetness of baked bread, the earthy aroma of pumpkin and herbs. Hunger, sharp and immediate, clawed at her insides, but it was not shame or fear that pressed her forward. It was the unmistakable presence of kindness, rare and unannounced in her life. Clara stammered. "I have nothing to offer you." Her voice trembled, betraying the mix of astonishment and disbelief in her chest. Taza's eyes, dark and steady, met hers. "You offer your presence," he said simply, as if the idea of presence itself were a rare gift of equal value. "It is enough." The little girl, Lena, stepped forward, her small hand resting on the edge of the basket. "We made this together," she said, her voice ringing in the cold air. "My papa cooks the meat. I made the bread. It is for you." Clara felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. Her life had been a series of harsh winters and lonely nights. She had learned self-reliance, had learned to fend off despair, but she had not anticipated this an offering of generosity, unasked, from someone she had barely known. The wind howled around them, carrying snow in flurries across the porch. But inside her heart, warmth spread slowly, reluctantly, then more boldly, filling the spaces that had long been hollow. She swallowed hard, steadied her voice, and finally whispered, "Please, come in." Taza bowed his head respectfully, a quiet gesture of understanding, and stepped inside, followed by Lena and Matu. The children's eyes sparkled as they took in the cabin, their curiosity shining brighter than any candlelight. Lena's gaze fell on the barren shelves, the empty hearth, the table set for a dinner that might not have existed a moment ago. She clutched her basket tighter, her small fingers brushing against the cloth. Clara led them to the table, feeling both awkward and relieved. The children giggled softly as they set down the clay pot and uncovered the basket, revealing a feast that filled the cabin with warmth and fragrance. The venison, roasted and glazed with juniper, sent up wisps of steam that tickled the nose. The blue corn bread, baked with loving hands, promised sustenance beyond what Clara had imagined possible. A thick stew, savory and aromatic, completed the unexpected bounty. As the food was set down, Clara's astonishment deepened. She had imagined lonely nights, empty plates, and bitter cold, but this was an act of defiance against despair itself. She watched as Taza knelt beside her chair, giving her a look that was neither boastful nor demanding, but gentle and considerate. The children busied themselves, placing the dishes and smiling shyly at Clara. A hush fell across the cabin for a moment. Then Taza lowered his head and offered a soft prayer in Apache, words flowing over the room with a rhythm that resonated in Clara's chest. He gave thanks for warmth, for food, for the gift of companionship, for neighbors who became family in spirit, if not yet in name. Clara, touched by the sincerity and solemnity of the words, felt tears threaten once more. But this time, they were not tears of despair, they were tears of relief, of wonder, of gratitude. Lena reached across the table and tugged gently at Clara's sleeve. "We worried about you," she said softly. "We wanted you to eat tonight." Her simple words struck deep, an innocence and honesty that had no place for fear or judgment. Clara smiled, the lines of grief softening just slightly. She motioned for the children to sit, and together they began the meal. Laughter soon followed, a soft, hesitant melody at first, then growing bolder. The cabin, once hollow and cold, filled with the warmth of shared presence, with the scent of food, with the promise that even in the harshest winter, kindness could find its way through the snow and the fear. Taza spoke little during the meal, but his quiet dignity and careful attention said more than words could. He asked about the children's schooling, about Clara's life before the winter, and about the small details of frontier survival. Clara found herself answering, not out of obligation, but because she wanted them to know her, to share herself with those who had so unexpectedly shared with her. As the evening wore on, she realized something profound. This was not just a meal. It was a bridge, a simple act of generosity that spanned the gap between loneliness and companionship, between suspicion and trust. It was a reminder that even in a world shaped by hardship and isolation, the human heart could reach out, could heal, could offer warmth when there was none. For the first time in months, Clara Hayes felt the grip of solitude loosen. A single knock on the door, a small act of courage from children and their father, had changed everything. In the middle of a snowbound frontier, on a night she had expected to endure alone, she had discovered hope, kindness, and the fragile beginnings of family. And so, the snow fell silently outside. The wind moaned through the ridges, but inside the small cabin, light and warmth danced across wooden walls. Clara Hayes, who had believed herself abandoned to the cold, realized that she was not alone. Not now, not ever. If she could open her door and her heart to the unexpected gifts, life sometimes sent gifts that arrived wrapped not in ribbons or paper, but in love, courage, and the courage of strangers who became family. Clara Hayes had never imagined that a cold, lonely Christmas Eve could transform into anything resembling warmth or hope. Yet now, with the smell of roasted venison and the soft glow of lantern light surrounding her, the impossible was happening. Across the small wooden table of her cabin, Taza and his children, Lena and Matu, unpacked a feast that seemed to have been conjured from the very heart of generosity. The first dish was a simple roast, but the aroma was intoxicating. Venison glazed with juniper berries, rich with the flavor of the wild and the care of hands that understood meat and fire. Clara's mouth watered, though she felt hesitant to reach out immediately. She had lived alone for so long that accepting kindness felt like stepping into a world she had forgotten existed. Lena, careful not to spill the basket of bread she had baked herself, set it in the center of the table. Blue corn loaves, warm and fragrant, rested side by side. The girl's small fingers brushed the cloth that covered the bread, and Clara noticed the pride in her eyes. She looked at Taza, whose quiet, commanding presence now carried a gentleness she had never seen. Matu, the youngest, carefully lifted the clay pot from its basket. Steam curled lazily into the air, carrying the rich scent of a thick stew filled with root vegetables and savory herbs. Clara caught a whiff and realized her stomach had been aching not from the cold alone, but from hunger, the raw, gnawing hunger of an empty winter. "Sit," Clara finally said, her voice trembling. She gestured to the chair across from her. Her hands shook as she poured the children some of the warm water she had for tea, and Taza took the chair beside the table. Bowing his head politely, a silence fell over the cabin, one that was neither awkward nor heavy. It was a pause, a quiet acknowledgement of the miracle that had brought them together. Taza lowered his eyes in respect and began a prayer, softly speaking in his native tongue. The cadence of the Apache words filled the room with an almost musical rhythm. He gave thanks for the fire that burned bright despite the snowstorm outside, for the food that would nourish them, and for the presence of neighbors who could become family in a world where loneliness often claimed more victories than people deserved. Clara watched the steam rise from the pot and curl around his words. Realizing she was holding her breath, listening, feeling something tender open in her heart. Tears pricked her eyes, and she hastily blinked them away, ashamed at the display. Yet the warmth from the food, the light from the lantern, and the sense of belonging could not be ignored. "Try this," Lena said, offering a slice of her bread to Clara. "I made it myself. Papa helped a little." Her small smile was bright, unashamed, and full of pride. Clara accepted the bread with shaking hands, and as she took a bite, the sweetness and care within it filled her in ways that went beyond mere taste. She realized she hadn't truly eaten a proper meal in days, but the nourishment went deeper than her stomach. It reached into her spirit, warming her from the inside out. Taza looked on quietly as Clara savored the first morsel. "Food is more than hunger," he said softly. "It is life, yes, but also respect. Sharing it is a way of saying you are not alone." Clara's throat tightened. The truth of his words pressed against the hollow ache she had carried through months of winter. Here, in a small frontier cabin surrounded by snow, she had been alone, lonely, cold, and fearful. Yet this act, this simple, human gesture, bridged the gap between despair and hope. As they ate, the children asked questions. Lena wanted to know about the books stacked on the shelf and the stories of frontier life Clara had survived. Matu, quiet but observant, asked about her small garden, curious how anything could grow in such harsh conditions. Clara answered carefully, her voice growing steadier, her words tinged with laughter she hadn't realized she had missed. For the first time in months, Clara felt the walls of isolation crumble. She watched Taza watching her children with quiet pride and realized the depth of his care and patience. He was strong, yes, but not only in the way of survival. He was strong in kindness, in quiet understanding, in the ability to offer without demanding anything in return. The wind continued to howl outside, snow piling higher against the cabin walls, but inside, warmth settled over them. It was not merely from the fire or the food, it came from something subtler, the act of being seen, the act of being remembered, the act of being welcomed. Clara began to share a few details about her own life, speaking in small bursts of memory, stories of Ethan, her husband, tales of the first winter she spent in the cabin alone, the hard lessons learned from loss and labor. Taza listened intently, never interrupting, his eyes steady and understanding. He nodded occasionally, acknowledging her hardships, acknowledging her survival. The children leaned in closer, eager to hear, to understand, to connect. In return, Taza shared quiet tales of his life, the years before he moved here, the loss of his wife 2 winters ago, the skills he had learned from his people to survive in this unforgiving land. Clara listened, marveling at the courage required to endure the losses he had suffered, at the dignity with which he bore his grief. As the night wore on, laughter began to thread its way through the cabin. Lena shared a story about a fox she had seen in the woods, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of excitement. Mato laughed shyly, joining in when his sister prompted him. And even Taza's voice, low and deliberate, carried warmth as he told a small anecdote about tracking a stubborn deer through the snow. Clara felt herself loosen, the tightness around her chest giving way to something rare, belonging. She realized that what they were doing together, sharing food, sharing stories, sharing presence, was the very act of building a bridge between hearts. Loneliness had ruled her for months. But now, with every smile, every shared glance, every laugh, the bridge grew stronger. By the time the feast was done, by the time dishes were cleared and placed near the hearth to cool, Clara felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in a year. Hunger had been sated, yes, but more importantly, the emptiness she had carried had begun to fill, not with wealth, not with possessions, not with fleeting comforts, but with human connection. Taza rose to his feet, glancing down at the children and then at Clara. "It is not enough to survive," he said quietly. "We must also live. And living, we share." Clara's hands were still trembling slightly as she reached out to touch his arm, a gesture that felt both natural and electric in its simplicity. She realized that the man who had once been just a neighbor had become something more, a bridge to hope, a symbol of kindness, and perhaps in time, a part of her family. As they settled into a quiet rhythm, the wind outside seemed to soften, the storm muted by the warmth inside. Lantern light flickered against the wooden walls, casting shadows that danced in time with the heartbeat of a small cabin full of life, full of laughter, full of connection. Clara Hayes, who had believed herself abandoned to the cold, now understood that human warmth was often found in the most unexpected gestures, in the arrival of a man and his children bearing gifts, in the courage to knock on a door in a storm, in the willingness to sit together and share what little one might have. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe in more than mere survival. She allowed herself to believe that bridges could be built, that families could be formed in unexpected ways, and that even the harshest winter could give birth to warmth, laughter, and hope. Clara Hayes awoke to a light that was different from the dim glow of her lanterns from the night before. The first rays of the rising sun filtered weakly through the frost-crusted windows of her cabin, casting a pale golden shimmer on the wooden floorboards. Outside, the snow sparkled as if the whole world had been sprinkled with diamonds, and the crisp morning air carried the faintest hint of pine and sage. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire still crackling softly in the hearth. Peering through the window, Clara's eyes widened. Across the small clearing beside her cabin, she saw Lena and Matu rolling snow into large, clumsy spheres, giggling in that way only children could. Their laughter rang through the quiet morning like a soft melody, breaking the usual monotony of a snowbound frontier. Behind them, Taza stood tall, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the horizon as if ensuring the world was safe for these moments of joy. He turned to glance at her cabin, and when their eyes met, a slow, small smile spread across his face, quiet, almost shy, but filled with warmth. Clara dressed quickly, pulling her thickest shawl around her shoulders, the fabric stiff with the lingering chill of night. Her steps on the snow-crusted floorboards were cautious, yet each step carried a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt for months. She opened the door, and a swirl of crisp air greeted her, carrying with it the smells of snow, smoke, and something else, something intangible, like hope itself. "Good morning," Taza said, his voice low and steady, but laced with a softness that made her heart skip. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice sounding brighter than it had in weeks. The children ran toward her, little feet crunching in the snow, cheeks pink with cold and excitement. Lena tugged at Clara's hand, leading her to the makeshift snowman they had begun sculpting near the creek bed. Mato was busy patting snow down, determined to create the perfect shape for the base. Clara crouched down, brushing the cold snow from her skirt, and helped them smooth the rough edges. They worked together, a trio bound by shared joy, laughter, and the quiet miracle of connection that had begun the previous night. After some time, Taza moved closer to the small fire pit he had built near the edge of the clearing. He knelt beside it, adding small twigs and kindling to keep the morning fire alive. The flames crackled, sending ribbons of smoke into the pale blue sky. Clara watched him, realizing how natural it had become to accept his presence here, not as a stranger, not as a distant neighbor, but as someone who had quietly become part of her life. "Would you like some breakfast?" Clara asked, smiling at the children as she gestured toward her cabin. The warmth of the fire inside beckoned, and she had prepared a simple meal: leftover bread from Lena's basket, hot water for tea, and a few small scraps of venison saved from the feast the night before. "Yes, please," Lena said eagerly, grabbing Clara's hand again and pulling her toward the cabin. Mata followed, hopping and laughing, his small mittens leaving streaks in the snow. Taza trailed behind, adjusting his cloak and glancing back at the children with a protective yet relaxed air. Inside, Clara set out the simple breakfast. The children eagerly dug in, their laughter and chatter filling the cabin with life. Clara poured herself a small cup of tea, the warmth of it seeping through her fingers and into her chest. For the first time in months, she felt fully present in a moment, no shadows of past grief, no pangs of hunger. Just the quiet contentment of being surrounded by life, by connection, by family she had never expected to find. After breakfast, Lena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bundle carefully wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Clara, eyes sparkling with pride. "We made this for you," she said. Clara unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate beaded bracelet, each bead chosen and threaded with care by the children. The colors were vibrant reds, blues, and yellows, and it carried the subtle scent of pine and smoke from their campfire. Clara's voice trembled as she accepted the gift. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Her hand shook as she fastened it around her wrist, feeling the tangible proof of the bond that had formed between them. The bracelet was more than beads on a string. It was a symbol of trust, affection, and the family that had grown from a single act of kindness. Taza stepped closer, lowering his gaze for a moment before speaking. "My people say that when you share winter food with someone, they become tied to your life. You now belong to our circle, Clara Hayes." His words were deliberate, carrying the weight of tradition and the honesty of his heart. Clara felt her chest tighten, the emotions of the past months converging into a single, overwhelming surge of gratitude and warmth. She reached out, placing her hand lightly over his. "And you? You're welcome in my home. Any day, any season," she said, her voice firm yet gentle, carrying a promise of mutual respect and companionship. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the world outside frozen and still. Yet inside the cabin and in the clearing, with children building snowmen and fires burning, something vital and tender was growing. Bonds were being forged not through grand gestures or elaborate ceremonies, but through the quiet acts of shared presence, generosity, and mutual care. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small joys. Clara helped the children repair their snowman, adding a small stick for arms and a stone for a nose. Taza taught her how to track small animals in the snow, showing her the subtle prints left by rabbits and birds, and how to predict where game might hide even in the thickest drifts. The children chattered constantly, filling the air with curiosity and laughter, and Clara found herself joining in, her own voice unselfconsciously warm and light. By noon, the snow had softened under the rising sun, and the wind had eased, leaving a quiet calm in the air. Clara paused on the porch, looking out at the landscape transformed by both nature and human presence. Here, in the midst of isolation and hardship, she had found a new rhythm of life, one that included neighbors, friends, and a sense of belonging she had not thought possible. Taza joined her, standing silently for a moment, watching the children play. "It was a lonely winter until you opened your door," he said quietly. "My children call you family now. I feel the same." Clara felt her breath catch, and a soft smile curved her lips. She looked at the man who had brought warmth into her coldest night and steadiness into her hollow days. "You saved my Christmas," she whispered. "And more than that, you saved me." He reached out, cupping her face gently, his hand steady, firm, and warm against the cold air. "No, we saved each other," he replied, his voice low, honest, and comforting. The children ran toward them, bringing a ball of snow that they had molded into an improvised gift. Clara laughed, feeling the sound echo off the snow-covered hills and into her heart. The morning stretched before them, full of possibilities, full of the kind of joy that cannot be bought or forced, only discovered in moments of shared humanity. And so, Christmas morning arrived like no other for Clara Hayes. It was not filled with abundance in the way she had once imagined, not marked by lavish gifts or feasts, but by the presence of people who had chosen to cross the snow, to break the silence, and to bring warmth to a lonely cabin. For the first time in months, Clara felt hope, not the fragile hope of a dream, but the steady, enduring hope of belonging, of connection. A family built not by blood, but by choice and love. In the quiet that followed, with snow melting softly around their feet and the sun rising higher into the sky, Clara realized something profound. The true gift of Christmas was not in food, not in warmth, not even in celebration, but in the simple, enduring act of human kindness. And in the act of accepting it, she had opened the door not only to neighbors, but to a future she could finally imagine, a life tied to those who would stand with her, laugh with her, and in time love her as deeply as she had begun to love them. The snow had finally begun to melt, leaving patches of brown earth and muddy streams snaking through the frontier landscape. The wind was softer now, carrying with it the sense of pine sap and wet soil, a promise of spring after months of frozen hardship. Clara Hayes stood at her cabin's threshold, watching as Lena and Mato chased each other across the yard, their laughter rising above the gentle gurgle of the thawing creek. The children's energy was endless, their joy boundless, and for Clara, it was a sound sweeter than any music she had heard in the quiet months of her solitude. Behind them, Taza worked steadily to repair the fence along the property line, his hands deft with the tools of the frontier. He paused occasionally to glance at Clara, offering a small nod or a quiet smile, the kind of smile that spoke of comfort, safety, and unspoken understanding. Clara's gaze lingered on him, noting how natural he had become in her life. Once he had been a distant figure, a neighbor she barely knew. Now he was central to her days, a steady presence that had quietly filled the emptiness she had felt since Ethan's death. The transformation of their lives had been subtle at first. The night Taza and his children brought the feast had cracked the shell of her isolation, but it was in the days and weeks that followed that true change had taken root. The children visited her daily, bringing small gifts of kindling, hand-carved trinkets, or freshly baked bread. They helped her with chores, laughed at her occasional clumsiness, and filled the cabin with warmth that was impossible to manufacture on one's own. Taza, for his part, had become a constant in ways both practical and profound. He repaired her fences, chopped wood for her fire, and taught her old frontier skills she had never thought she would need to know. He showed her how to track rabbits in the woods, how to find dry kindling beneath snow, how to read the sky for signs of approaching storms. Each lesson was patient, deliberate, and filled with care. Clara had come to rely on him not just for survival, but for companionship, guidance, and quiet comfort. In return, Clara had shared the skills she had learned in her own life. She taught the children to read, showing Lena and Matu the joy of discovering new worlds in the pages of books. She baked biscuits with them, letting them knead dough and shape loaves with sticky, small fingers. She repaired Taza's worn clothing, patching it with her needle and thread, and slowly, subtly, a rhythm of shared life began to take hold. The boundaries between neighbors, once marked by distance and caution, dissolved into something deeper, something like family. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridges, casting a warm amber glow across the cabin and the thinning snow, Clara found herself standing beside Taza by the creek. The children were nearby, building a small dam with rocks and mud, their laughter carrying across the water. Clara turned to him, feeling a mixture of gratitude, affection, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable than she had dared to acknowledge. "It's strange," she said softly, "how life changes. Just a few weeks ago, I would have spent every day alone, keeping warm and counting the hours. Now?" She trailed off, searching for words. "Now we are not alone." Taza finished for her, his voice quiet, steady and reassuring. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for a moment, the wind, the creek, and the world beyond ceased to exist. There was only this two people standing together, hearts tethered by shared trials and newfound hope. Clara's breath caught. She realized that what had begun as one small act of generosity, the simple decision to bring a feast to a lonely cabin on Christmas Eve, had transformed into something far more significant. It had become the foundation of a new life, one built not on bloodlines or formal bonds, but on the shared experience of surviving the frontier, on kindness, trust, and the gradual weaving of hearts together. The children ran up to them then, breathless from play, their cheeks pink and shining. Lena held up a small pinnacone she had decorated with twine, presenting it to Clara with pride. Mata offered a handful of wildflowers he had found in the thawing snow, their petals bright against the muddy ground. Clara knelt to accept them, her hands trembling with emotion. The gifts were small, yet in them was a message: "You belong here with us." Taza watched the exchange, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It seems they've claimed you as family," he said softly. "And you?" Clara asked, her eyes meeting his. He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. "I feel the same," he admitted. "What began as neighbors or strangers has become more. It has become life shared." The words settled between them, simple and profound. There was no rush, no grand declaration, only the quiet understanding that they were bound now by more than circumstance. They were bound by choice, by affection, by the mutual recognition of the value of presence and care. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of shared life continued. Clara, Taza, and the children became a unit in all but name. They celebrated small victories: a fence repaired, a successful hunt, a garden sprouting its first shoots. They faced challenges together: storms, illness, the occasional threat from the untamed wilderness. But each day, the sense of belonging and mutual support strengthened. What had started as one act of kindness snowballed into a life intertwined. A family formed from the most unlikely of circumstances. One afternoon, as spring began to assert itself fully, Clara sat with Taza on the porch, watching Lena and Mata chase each other along the creek bank. She felt a deep, quiet contentment settle over her, one that had nothing to do with material wealth or comfort, and everything to do with human connection. "You've changed my life," she said softly. Turning her gaze to Taza, he looked at her, the firelight of the setting sun casting shadows across his features, and said quietly, "No, we changed each other." That night, it was the beginning, but it was not just one night. It was every day since, and every moment we shared. Clara smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes. "I never imagined I could feel this. Safe, this complete after so long." Taza reached out, brushing her cheek, and she leaned into the warmth of his hand. "Life on the frontier is harsh," he said, "but it teaches us something." It teaches us that family can be chosen, that love can grow where we least expect it, and that even strangers can become home. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Clara looked out at the land she had once thought of as lonely and unforgiving. Now it was a canvas of life, laughter, and belonging. She felt the presence of Taza at her side, the children nearby, the warmth of the cabin behind her, and the realization that what had begun as a desperate winter night had become a new beginning, a family not born of blood, but forged in kindness, courage, and love. Clara Hayes had been saved not by wealth, not by chance, but by the gentle courage of a man and his children who had walked through snow and wind to bring warmth, food, and companionship. And in returning that courage and opening her heart, she had found something even rarer, home. The frontier had once seemed like a place of isolation and struggle, but now it was a place of connection and promise. Strangers had become family, loneliness had been replaced with laughter, and what had begun as a cold Christmas Eve ended as a lifetime of shared warmth, love, and hope. And for Clara, Taza, Lena, and Matu, the memory of that first unexpected feast remained sacred, a reminder that even in the harshest winters, kindness could bloom into life, and that strangers, with courage and heart, could indeed become family.